as we study this morning the details of your passion. Please help us to grow in our love for you. Please help us to follow you with faithfulness and great sincerity and devotion. Amen. Amen. Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Well, this morning we are going to be going through, beginning with, last week we did Palm Sunday. Today we are going over to Luke chapter 22. And we are going to be looking at the events that occurred around the Last Supper. So if you would please turn to Luke chapter 22, and when you get to that chapter, go to verse 14. Chapter 22, verse 14. And as I said last time, I would like us, if possible, to take turns reading that section of the gospel. So where it says, in your Bible, it probably has in dark print, the Last Supper. Would someone want to read that section? Okay, I'll bring you the mic.
Then an argument broke out among when the hour came, he took his place at table with the apostles. He said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I shall not eat it again until there is fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup, gave thanks, and said, Take this and share it among yourselves. For I tell you that from this time on, I shall not drink of the new wine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took the bread, said a blessing, broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body, which will be given for you. Do this in memory of me. And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, This cup is the new covenant of my blood, which will be shed for you.
Thank you. And so what we have here is the heart of what we celebrate each time we come to Mass. Each time we come to Mass, we are reenacting the Last Supper. And the Last Supper, the meal that Jesus was at, had a long history. And it goes way back to rituals that were carried on in the ancient world. They originally came from ancient rural festivals. There was a ceremony of taking a sheaf of barley and waving it before the heavens, and a ritual of eating unleavened bread that honored the spring barley harvest. The ritual of religiously sacrificing a newborn lamb celebrated the birth of the spring lambs. So you have these rituals carried out to celebrate the first fruits of the harvest and the birth of the spring lambs. That goes way back. Now, Jesus comes to the Last Supper, and he does what he did on Palm Sunday. You remember on Palm Sunday that he sent two of the disciples ahead to get that colt. It was like he had told somebody ahead of time, somebody's coming to get the colt from you. And now at this feast, he sends to the disciples that they should go and find a man who would be carrying a water jar, and that person would give them get a room for them, an upper room where they could celebrate this meal. Now, the better class houses in Israel had two rooms, one on top of the other, just like you pile one box on top of another. And the upper room is one you would reach with an outside stairway. The upper room was reached by the outside stairway, and during Passover time, all lodging in Jerusalem was free. How about that? Wouldn't you like to go to a big celebration and you can stay any place and it's free? And if you wanted to pay the person for staying there, what they usually used for payment was the skin of a lamb. Okay? And it was also used, the upper room outside of being used for a meal, was also used for a place where a rabbi might meet to instruct his disciples. And Jesus took the steps to procure such a room. He sent Peter and John to look for a man carrying a water jar. Now, how would they know which man it is? Because women carried water jars. Men did not. But there was going to be a man carrying a water jar. That's the guy you talk to. So Jesus had it all figured out. Go find a man carrying a water jar. That's the one you talk to. And then he would procure the room for them. And so everything was prearranged. Now, what we do not know for sure is, did Jesus celebrate this meal on the day everybody was celebrating this meal? And we don't think so. We don't know. But what we do know is it was Passover time. Okay? It was Passover time, and many scholars believe Jesus anticipated the celebrating of the meal by a day. Because when Jesus is dying the next day, when he's being nailed to the cross, it's the hour at which the Passover lambs were being sacrificed at the temple. And then the people would take them home and cook them and eat them. So we think Jesus anticipated the feast because he knew he was going to die. So we can't say for sure when everybody was eating the Passover meal, Jesus was having the Last Supper. We don't know for sure. All the scriptures do seem to indicate is that it was Passover time. It was spring. Now, Jesus came to the Passover, and he said, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. What it is revealing to us is the intensity of his love. And think of your own life when you are going to go away with somebody. I mean, and you're going to go away and you're going to be gone for a while. You might have a last meal with the people closest to you. Or if somebody dies, one of the things you're going to remember is the last time you ate with them, or the last Christmas you had with them, the last Easter you had with them, because there is something about meals that intensify relationships. And so, think of your own life, but when someone was going away, maybe you have a son or daughter who was going away to study in Europe and they were going to be gone for months. What do? You go out to eat. Or you have a big meal at home and invite all their friends. It's like a ritual to say goodbye. So that's the attitude with which the Lord Jesus comes to the Last Supper. And the intensity of his love will be revealed as they go through it. Now, it was Passover time, and the Israelites, the Jews, would be celebrating the Passover meal. Well, what was that like? And I really believe I have gone through that with you before. You remember?
No.
No.
I'm sorry.
You don't remember? Okay. All right. And I thought I had a copy with me, but that's okay. I can talk about it. The Passover meal was to celebrate the greatest event that happened in the history of the Israelites. And what was that event? Moses, the Exodus, thank you. Never forget, the greatest story in the Old Testament is that of the Israelites being led from slavery to freedom. Oh yeah, I know I talked about this last year. That was last year, that was a long time ago, right? Okay, what was the Passover meal like? Well, they wanted to keep the story alive. That's the purpose of the Passover meal, to keep the story alive. Now, there are different ways of keeping a story alive. You can tell it over and over. Today, you could make a movie about it, or a DVD, or you could really go over to the place, I guess, and take a plane and go over to Egypt and go to the Red Sea. I don't think you could walk through it anymore. There's the Suez Canal. But you could geographically walk through it, act it out. And all of those are possibilities, except for I don't think you really could go over and walk through the Red Sea. But their way of acting it out, reenacting that whole journey was, you can't act it out on a stage or anything like that, so we will have a meal in which we reenact the whole thing. Think of our holiday of Thanksgiving. You know, you could go to Boston. You know, you could act out the Pilgrims landing, you know, near Plymouth Rock. You could do that. Movies have been made about it. Okay? But what do we do at home? We have a meal with turkey and cranberries and pumpkin pie and squash and the things we think they had at their first Thanksgiving meal. So in a way, we reenact that story of the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock. So what the Jews did is they had a meal to reenact the story of the crossing over from slavery to freedom, the story of Moses and the Exodus. And they did it with this meal. And so different items at the meal had different meanings. And the Jewish people had different blessing prayers for the different kinds of foods that were brought to the table. We say, bless us, O Lord, in these thy gifts. No. When the different foods were brought to the table, they said a different prayer. So to reenact slavery and all the bitterness of slavery, they had bitter herbs. Okay? I should say that the meal began with the lighting of the candles, and the mother of the household lit the candles and said a very special prayer for her loved ones. And then they prayed, the father of the family would pray, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, who creates the fruit of the soil. And they would eat the green herbs, which would be like celery, and they would, radishes, they would dip those bitter herbs into a little glass, a small glass of salt water. And so they were reminded of the bitterness of slavery and the tears. The salt water was the tears of the people who are suffering under oppression. They had a kind of salad, it was a mixture, it was called haroses, Haroses, haroses. It looks like applesauce. And it was a mixture of apples and raisins and nuts. And what they would do when the unleavened bread was brought to the table is they would use part of it to spread on the bread. And the spreading on the bread reminded them of the kind of work they did when they were in slavery. And that was to spread mortar between the bricks to build the monuments for the Egyptians. So they would eat some of it and then save some of it to spread on that bread. They were reenacting the kind of work they did when they were in slavery. And then at one point, the unleavened bread would be brought to the table, and the father would pray, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, who brings forth the bread from the soil." And at one point, at the point when the unleavened bread was brought to the table, the youngest child in the family, and no matter how young they were, they could have been 20 and been the youngest, or they could have been, 7 and been the youngest. They were to ask the father the question, what is the meaning of the unleavened bread? Why do we celebrate this? And that gets the father into telling the story. And so the father then would tell the whole story of that book of Exodus. And even though they know it, because they've had this year after year, it was very important that they tell the story again. That they keep repeating it so it's fresh in your mind every year. Every year you are hearing that story of how you were led from slavery to freedom. At the meal, they had 4 glasses of wine. And again, the father would pray, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine." As they talked about this story of the Exodus, it would get them to talk about not only that story, which we know as the book of Exodus, but to talk about the centuries that followed. I'm sure that Jewish people sitting down today would talk a lot about their experiences of the Nazis and World War II, and how God still kept their race alive. It did not experience extinction, which was Hitler's desire. And so they would talk about the hardship that people have experienced ever since. They talked about all that's going on in Israel today, and the tensions and the shootings and all of that, and how God is still taking care of them and preserving their race. Today, only 3 or 4% of the world is Jewish. Very small number. But they would talk about how God is still taking care of them as his chosen people. So that Passover could go on 3 or 4 hours. You think 4 glasses of wine, oh my. No, it would go on for a long time. It started in the evening, could go till midnight. It was a long time. And then the Passover lamb was brought to the table, and they shared a meal. They shared the main part of the meal, the Paschal lamb, and all the veggies and all of that were brought to the table. At the end of that main part of the meal, the table was cleared, and there was only 1 cup of wine, a big chalice, that was brought to the table. And it was called, there were 4 cups of wine. I think the first one was called the cup of thanksgiving, the second one was the cup of remembrance, and then the third one was called the cup of blessing, and the fourth one was the cup of consummation. And so the father would then pass that cup of blessing around the table, and he would pray a long prayer of thanksgiving, and they would sing some psalms and have the 4th cup, and that would be the end of the meal. The key point of the whole Passover, the key point, was when the father passed around, and again, they were individual cups now, the 2nd cup of wine. The 2nd cup of wine, before they drank the 2nd cup, the father would say this. It's rather early in the meal. The father would say this: in each generation, every person ought to regard themselves as though they had personally come out of Egypt. Therefore, it is our duty to praise and laud and glorify and thank and exalt the Lord our God, who has brought us from slavery to freedom, from darkness to light, from mourning to festive day, from subjection to redemption. And so that attitude with which they came to the Passover is extremely important, because it ties in with the attitude we ought to have when we go to Mass. Okay? In every generation, each person ought to regard themselves as though they had personally come out of Egypt. And that remembering how, oh God, yeah, God led me from slavery. You know, I had a serious illness and now I got well. You know, that kind of thing. God did that for me. And so they are aware that the movement from slavery to freedom is ongoing. God is always doing that. And so we should come to Mass. At Mass, we are remembering Jesus' death and resurrection. Do you mean at Mass I have to come to Mass with the attitude, I have died, I have personally died and been raised up? Is that the attitude with which I am supposed to come to Mass? Yes or no?
No.
I don't think so.
I look forward to coming to a celebration of new life in Christ.
So we have not died and risen, right?
So far.
We have not died and risen.
We're looking forward to it.
We have been baptized. Do you remember last year? No, you don't.
More than 2 weeks.
We do a poor job of teaching baptism. We do a really poor job of teaching baptism. We have died with Christ, and we have risen through the waters of baptism. The waters of baptism have led us from the slavery of sin to the freedom of the children of God. We have reenacted the death, resurrection of Jesus through the sacrament of baptism. And so when we come to Mass, you know, the priest could hold up the chalice and say, in each generation, every person ought to regard themselves as though they had been crucified with Christ and raised from the dead. That's the heart of baptism, and we do a lousy job of teaching it. All we talk about is original sin, you know? Original sin, and that it's a whole lot more than that. Why do we put the white gown on? You're a new person. You're a new person. You're risen from the dead. That's the symbolism of the white gown. We get the candle. You are walking in the light of Christ, and then we spend our whole life becoming who we already are. We are Jesus Christ, risen from the dead.
We never talk about original blessing.
Yeah, we never talk about original blessing, which, yes, you're absolutely right.
All sin,
Yeah, we don't talk about how that's another whole class, but you're right, you're absolutely right. And so, we have put on Christ, and we spend our whole life becoming who we already are, and we miss it. We miss it. Somehow we miss it, and we think we're going to meet Jesus at the end of our life, and he's already living within us, as is the Father and the Holy Spirit. Okay, so that was the key sentence. You're at Passover meal, and you're celebrating all of this because you're regarding yourself as part of the story. I don't know that we see ourselves as part of the story of the New Testament. But we have, in many ways, walked the same paths as Jesus did. We've all had our own enunciations. We've all had life planned and God messed it up. We've all had our own burdens. We all have had our own healings. And we've all suffered in many ways. And so we have walked the path with Jesus. And we celebrate dying and rising with him every time we come to Mass. Now, during what you have here, why don't you stop a moment and just ask yourself, I know we did this last year, but ask yourself, what does it mean to understand baptism that way? At your tables, talk about it for a minute.
That's right. Hard to remember. That are brought into the university, you know, you go there and check the lives. I understand
Okay, we will come back to our discussion. When the unleavened bread was brought to the table, we believe that this is when the unleavened bread was brought, the Father would pray, "Blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth." And then Jesus would have said, "Take this all of you and eat it. This is my body." And so the unleavened bread for the Jew would call to mind the unleavened bread they baked before they left Egypt. Remember, they mixed the dough without putting leaven in, so they didn't have to wait for it to rise. And they ate it and then got on with their journey before Pharaoh and his army would attack them. That's the unleavened bread. Well, what Jesus was saying by his actions and his words is that from now on, it's not that bread that you remember. From now on, it will not be the bread you ate before you left Egypt that you will remember, but this is my body, which will be given for you. And then when the table was cleared after the meal was over and the cup of blessing was brought, he would have prayed, "Blessed art thou, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth the fruit from the vine." Then he would have said, "This is the chalice of my blood." In other words, the wine represented the covenant. The wine, of course, makes people happy. It's joyful. Now, 4 glasses would make you very happy. But, you know, it was a sign of, yes.
That 4 glasses isn't so bad. The water was so bad for these people. There were many diseases, so wine was a better way of drinking and washing. So it wasn't the alcohol, but it was the benefit of the fruit of the vine.
Thank you. Yeah, in many countries today, the water is not safe to drink. And I have heard it said that the Jews boiled their wine so that the alcohol was released from it. So it wasn't about partying like we do in Wisconsin. In Wisconsin, you say Wisconsin, and it's people drinking beer and getting drunk. Yeah.
Right.
Sister, you just said that the fourth chalice this is my blood. Isn't that Christ? I mean, that's not the Jewish.
That's what I'm saying, Jesus changed.
Well, that I know, but what does the father of the Jewish family say on the fourth, with the fourth chalice?
The fourth cup of wine would be the fourth cup of wine. Blessed are you, Lord our God. I think.
So it isn't blood like.
No, it was the
you-
blood was the third cup. And you know what the problem is, Jesus never had a fourth cup. Jesus never had the fourth cup of wine. Or did he? There's a book written by Scott Hahn called The Fourth Cup. It's not a long book. When they did not finish that's a good question. They did not finish the Passover meal. I'm jumping way ahead now, but they did not finish it. When did Jesus drink the fourth glass of wine?
At the cross.
On the cross. And you'll notice when, he said, I thirst, they gave him a sponge dipped in wine, sour wine. They put it to his lips, and when he drank it, he said, it is finished. What's the it?
The messianic message.
It could be, his life is over. It could be, now the Passover is done. Now the meal is completed. So, yeah, all of the above. Yes.
I still have a question, because now you just said that the third chalice would be blood, but what blood? The blood they splashed on the doorposts?
No.
I mean, because Jesus wasn't there yet.
Right, the wine represented the covenant.
Isn't that what the fourth cup was?
Well, all the wine, just like all the bitter herbs represented slavery,
Yeah.
all the wine represented the covenant. What he was saying is, this is the new covenant in my blood. Just like he said, this is my body, which meant you're no longer remembering this unleavened bread as the bread you ate when you left Egypt to get out in a hurry. You are now, whenever you eat this bread now, you are remembering my body. You are eating my body.
That's Jesus, though.
Yes.
How about the father of doing the Seder meal?
During the Seder meal, the Father said the Jewish prayer, and the wine represented the covenant made at Mount Sinai.
And that was the third chalice.
All of it, all four cups,
Okay.
represented the wine, the joy of the promises of God, God fulfilling his promises, God saving them. All four cups. And Jesus takes the third cup and says, this is the cup of my blood, the blood of the new and everlasting covenant. Is that cleared up
Yeah,
for you?
yeah,
Okay,
we got separated.
yeah. And the fourth cup, Jesus did not drink at the meal. The scriptures don't mention it. He went to the cross, and that's where he had the last drink.
A couple of days before this, Jesus had said, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, and people left. And Peter stayed, and the apostles stayed. So when Jesus was saying at the Last Supper, this is my body, this is my blood, I was guess that Peter would heave a sigh of relief. Oh, yay, okay, this is what would.
Yeah, and it wasn't a couple days before.
When was it?
She's referring to John chapter 6, when Jesus gave that long discourse. And now we have, I'm not a scripture scholar. Father God, where are you? Jesus gave the bread of life this summer. Those of you who were here, we went through that whole thing. And Jesus said, my flesh is real food, my blood is real drink. And unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you will not have life, etc. That discourse follows the multiplication of the loaves, and it's somewhere during those 3 years of Jesus' public life. And John is the only one that has that discourse in his gospel. John does not have the institution of the Eucharist in his gospel. If you go to John's gospel, what does he describe at the Last Supper? The washing of the feet. Okay? Now, as I recall learning it, and I could be wrong, it's like by the time John writes the gospel, his gospel, the church is well into celebrating the liturgy. John is the last person to write the gospel. He's writing around the year 100, or between 90 and 100. And by that time, people are used to celebrating this, but some people, as people do today, are raising questions. How can this be? Oh, yeah, Jesus didn't mean it that way, but how could it be that we eat his body and drink his blood? So John puts in that Eucharistic discourse in the middle of his gospel, chapter 6, right after the multiplication of the loaves. I don't want to go any farther because I might make a mistake. God help me if I make a mistake. I don't want to make a mistake. I really, this is so sacred that I really don't want to say anything that would mislead people, you know. And so I believe I said last summer that people regard that Eucharistic discourse as John's description of the institution of the Eucharist, but he places it in Jesus' public life, not at the Last Supper. Yes?
Well, as you're talking, and not to get into any depth than you were, is we have to look at each of these writings, when they were written, what was the aim of the writer, who was the audience, and how does it affect our lives today? And I think we have to have a mindset that carries through the theme of what you were talking about.
Thank you. You said it very well. For each of the Gospels, you have to, be aware of when and why it was written. Okay? And not take it exactly literally, that this is, and well, how do you know? You study, you read, but just know that what Pat is talking about was in the middle of Jesus' public life. Okay. Jesus instituted the Eucharist. Oh, I gotta back up. What you have here in Luke's gospel are kind of like two things. If you look at verses 16 to 18, he says, I tell you, I shall not eat it again until there is fulfillment in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup and gave thanks and said, take this and share it among yourselves. I tell you that from this time on I shall not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. So he gives them a cup to drink, okay? And what he is saying is, he looks forward to the future, when he will enjoy the banquet of heaven. And at that time, the Passover will have reached its fulfillment. And that will be the absolute conclusion of the old Passover. So he's saying, I will not drink this again until the Passover will have reached its fulfillment, the heavenly banquet. He's looking forward to the future. And then later on he will say, this is the chalice of my blood. Okay? And so the symbolism of the Passover meal, still present, resides into the background. The Passover just keeps fading into the background as Jesus begins a new meal with its own symbolism. Do I dare ask if there are any questions?
Well, he's ending, in a sense, the concept of the Old Testament looking to the new life.
Exactly. Yes.
You,
Not to be argumentative,
yes, you are.
but we're talking about this symbolizes this and this symbolizes that and all of these things. And then you get to verse 19 and 20 and all of a sudden it's not symbolic, this is my blood. And obviously lots of lives have been lost over that argument, whether it's symbolic or real. And I don't really want to start that argument, but it's just, how can it be, it's okay to be symbolic up here, then all of a sudden it has to be taken word, very specifically.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's a bad question.
Well, and that's when you go, then you turn pages to John's Gospel where Jesus says, you know, my flesh is real food, my blood is real drink. And the question you're asking could very well be the question the Jewish people were asking. How can this be? You're eating human flesh? People still ask it today.
Half of the Catholics.
At least half of Catholics believe it's a symbol or a representation. Okay? I read somewhere a long, long time ago that there are 40 different words Jesus could have used. This is an image of my body, this is a representation of my body, this is a symbol of my body, this makes you think of my body. But he used is. Is. And did the Jewish people regard it only as a symbol? That's another question.
No,
Or
because they left.
did they, no, I'm talking about something different. When the Jewish people ate the unleavened bread, did they regard it as this is the unleavened bread that our forefathers ate? Did they regard it that way?
Well, wasn't it made the same way?
Yes, yes, it was made the same way.
Why would they question that?
What?
Why would they question that? If they made it the same way, it is the same unleavened bread.
Why would they question it? You have to get the book. You have to get the book. Jesus and the Jewish roots of the Eucharist. You have to get that book. Okay? And read it carefully. I read it 3.5 times. It's very good. You can find it at Barnes and Noble. It's very, very good.
Jesus and,
Jewish roots of the Eucharist. Do I dare ask if there are any other questions? I'm not sure, sir, that I answered your question correctly. I'm not sure that I did.
He doesn't.
All I can say is that I gotta think about this. But I did read one time, there were many words Jesus could have used, and he used the word is, and they would have understood this
And with your
is.
spirit.
Okay?
Intransitive verb that agrees with the subject.
Okay, now Jesus instituted the Eucharist in the context of a prayer called the Barakah. Okay, Barakah. I don't know if you can read that, but that's, and I don't know if that's the exact spelling. It was the Jewish prayer of thanksgiving. So, and the Jewish prayer was, blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the bread from the earth. And blessed art thou, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. And in the context of that great prayer, he institutes the Eucharist. And so what that says is we experience God's hospitality. Breaking bread and distributing it is an act that creates community. So what Jesus is doing at the meal is two things with that prayer. He is first of all saying the great prayer of thanksgiving, the Barakah. He is praying to God. And then he says, take this all of you and eat it. This is my body. And he is sharing it with his disciples. And so what you have is two movements. A vertical movement of giving thanks and praise to God, and the horizontal movement of breaking and distributing the bread. And so he gives thanks to God first, and then he shows God's hospitality by breaking and distributing the bread. But God comes first. He gives praise and thanks to God, and then shares. Now, if you think about the Mass, this is what, at the Mass, after the bread and wine are consecrated, what does the priest do? Mindful of his passion, death, and resurrection, and looking forward to his coming and glory, what do? We offer you the bread of life and the chalice of eternal salvation. Then later in the Mass, he distributes it. The same thing Jesus did. The first thing we do with the consecrated elements is offer them to God. Then we share them. Now this is a little aside, but that is one of the differences, with all due respect for all denominations, that is one of the major differences between Catholic liturgy and Protestant liturgy, where they have bread and wine. Okay? And I've been at a Lutheran service where they had bread and wine, and the minister said what we call the institution narrative. On the night before he died, Jesus took bread, etc., blessed it, broke it, etc., etc. And shortly after that, he distributes it. He does not offer it to God first. Now that's huge. You understand this whole thing, this Barakah prayer, that is huge. To do the institution narrative and then distribute it without offering to God. Because offering to God was so much at the heart of Jewish worship. Sacrifice at the temple was so much a part of Jewish worship. And so not doing that makes a big difference. And so I've heard people say, well, I went to this Lutheran or maybe Methodist or Presbyterian church, and they had the body and blood. That's where I would stop you right there. But we had bread and wine, and it's not the same. And they don't call their ministers priests. A priest offers sacrifice. Huge difference. Doesn't mean we're better than they are or God loves us more. It simply means we're different. And this is how we are different. We offer the bread and wine. We offer the body and blood of Jesus to God. Then it is distributed. Just like Jesus prayed the Barakah prayer and then distributed. And there can be an argument, and there has been, the whole concept of Jesus saying for you and for many or for all. What about all? What about many? As I read, and I could be wrong, it depends on how you translate the word. And people have argued, well, when consecrates the chalice, this is my blood which shall be shed for you and for all, or for you and for many. Today it's for you and for many. In the past it was for you and for study the origin. Some people have questioned, why do we say many instead of all? Evidently the origin of the word goes back to it means the same thing. So I'm going to let that go, and if you have a question, you just ask Father God. But when he says it will be shed for you and for all, or for many, he is saying that he is offering himself. He's not there for himself. He's there for you and for all of us. And so he will bring God's forgiveness. And how will he do that? He will take on the role of the suffering servant. And so in Jesus himself, God confronts evil and overcomes it. God himself will suffer to bring about expiation. before we go further, I didn't think it would take this long, but that's okay, that's okay. Do you have questions? Anything? Then let me ask you this, just briefly at your table, talk about this. If somebody asked you, how do you explain what Catholics do at Mass? How would you answer that? Somebody comes to you and says, you know, I've gone to this church or that church, but you do these strange things at Mass. And people have said that Catholic ritual is so ceremonial and so formal. You know. But what do you guys really do at Mass? How would you
Daydream.
answer that?
I don't know who would ask the question.
And I don't know how it's different from anyone else.
Well, one of the things being brought up is always going to be, how are the young then converting, being instructed today? Do they have any of the fields for the past? Then I feel very well, or even Jewish people, they have children, so their children.
Yeah, but it just doesn't go beyond the Passover, it doesn't go into the story of Jesus. So, I'm sure they're doing just the same stuff.
They tell the story and they remind themselves. I mean, I think it's just that she described stories to the same today. You know, you have prayers, you have the story, you relive that experience.
Didn't he give the part of the message?
They have some formal program for training. I don't know that it's, if you had 1,000 Jewish people in the United States here,
There are lots of non-practice, there are a lot of non-practicing Jewish people too.
They say what
When I converted,
And not only the Exodus, but things that happened since then. She mentioned Nazis, she mentioned
well, and they've got to have some concern for what's happening in Israel. They reflect
God is in there.
Okay, have you got it figured out? You have to make it very clear when you explain to somebody else what we do at Mass, and I guess I was more interested in what you would say about the liturgy of the Eucharist rather than the liturgy of the Word. The liturgy of the Word is pretty evident, you know. The first reading and the Gospel match each other. The responsorial sound echoes the first reading, all of that. But the liturgy of the Eucharist, you know, all Christian churches would have a liturgy of the Word of some kind. But the liturgy of the Eucharist is where it, you know, that's where the division happens. Our priest at home, way back, before the Vatican Council, our priest at home, in the Polish ghetto of Oshkosh, do you know how in the olden days the pews had these little things tacked on the back? These little clips where the men could hang their hats and their caps, and there was and in some of the churches they would put labels inside that said the name of a family, and that was their pew. Remember that? Well, he took all of those out. He took all of those out, and he put a label in each of those little hat racks on the whole church, and on that label were these words. He said, you can describe the liturgy of the Eucharist in 5 words. We offer and receive Jesus. So in the label it said, at Mass, we offer and receive Jesus. So we offer ourselves through the presentation of the gifts, but it is, the gifts become the body and blood of Jesus. We offer Jesus to God, and then at the end of the Eucharistic prayer, we go to God through him, with him, in him. The tremendous action that goes on. And I've been saying lately, when we come to Mass, we reenact the Last Supper. And remember, Jesus said, do this in remembrance of me, do this in memory of me. What does it mean to commemorate? Remember does not mean recall. I think I've said that a few times. Memory does not mean we're in 2019 looking back at the year 33 and saying, oh, that's what Jesus did, wasn't that nice? It's that we're stepping back into history to join the apostles at the table. Reenact means to make it, or remember means to make it real again. To make it real again. And so I like to say we're sitting around the table, we're standing at the foot of the cross, and we're kneeling before the risen Lord with the words of Thomas, my Lord and my God. We sit around the table, we stand at the cross, we kneel in awe before the risen Lord. All of that action, which is our basic story, we dramatize at the Eucharist. Questions? Anybody have a question? All of that from one paragraph, okay? And so I will not have to prepare next week's class because I didn't get halfway through this week's class. I do want to, we got a couple minutes. If we go to the next section, it's the betrayal foretold, a very short 3 verses there. Jesus says, the hand of the one who is to betray me is with me at the table. For the Son of Man indeed goes as it has been determined, but woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. And they began to debate among themselves, who among them would do such a deed. And so Jesus adapts the announcement of Judas. He does not mention Judas' name. What he is really doing is admonishing everybody. Jesus is admonishing everybody. He doesn't say Judas will betray me. And the reason Luke doesn't have him saying any specific name, it's this betrayal passage is meant for everybody. So when Jesus says, behold, someone will betray me, I have to read it and ask myself what the apostles did, is it I? So Luke is taking this one betrayer, Judas, and spreading that betrayal act over the entire community. He's universalizing the account. He's universalizing the account. He's making that statement apply to everybody. And this is what makes the disciples question one another, because it hasn't named anybody. And so as we read this, we always have to ask ourselves, am I the one? Am I the one who would betray the Lord? Okay, well, we got that far. Next week we'll go on from there. Okay, thank you very much.